What if the snow itself could keep secrets, burying them beneath its pale silence until the world forgot? In the bitter winter of 1875, in the wind-lashed fields of Nebraska, a group of schoolchildren vanished into the storm, only to be found days later, stiff and lifeless, their small bodies locked in grotesque stillness. Their faces were frozen in terror, their hands clawed as if reaching for something unseen. And at the heart of it all stood a single schoolhouse, its windows black with frost, holding a truth no one dared speak aloud. Before we open the doors of this forsaken schoolhouse and unearth the whispers that winter left behind, I ask you to join this journey through shadowed history. Subscribe now, so that when the storm rises again, you will not be left outside in the cold. The prairie stretched endless and white in that winter of 1875, a land where silence itself seemed sharpened into knives by the storm. Snow fell in sheets, blanketing every fence, every tree, until the world dissolved into a single colorless void. And there, rising from the flat expanse like an intruder, stood the schoolhouse. A box of rough wood, its seams leaking frost, its chimney coughing weak smoke into the howling sky. It was not built to withstand the kind of storm that had descended upon Nebraska. Yet within those fragile walls, nearly 24 children clung to its meager shelter as though it were the only ship in a drowning sea. Inside, the iron stove glowed faintly, its warmth pitiful against the icy breath that slipped through cracks in the boards. The children pressed close, their coats thin, their boots already crusted with frozen slush. Their voices wavered in the dimness, not laughter, not song, but nervous whispers, fragments of prayers muttered through chattering teeth. Some stared at the frost patterns spreading over the windows, intricate veins of ice that looked almost alive. Others rocked gently in silence, too cold, too hungry, too frightened to speak. At the center of this fragile flock stood Miss Ellison, their teacher, her face pale but stern, her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. She was young, scarcely more than 20 herself, yet the storm had carved new lines across her brow. She tended the fire with trembling hands, coaxing flames from dwindling wood. Every spark felt like a promise she could not keep. She told the children they would be fine, that the storm would pass, that parents would come soon. But the words rang hollow in the frozen air. The wind battered the walls with sudden force, rattling the window panes like teeth in a skull. Every gust seemed to push harder, as though testing the building's strength. The sound was unearthly, a roar, then a scream, then a low moan that seemed to circle the roof. The children flinched, some clutching their ears, others pressing closer together. One boy whispered that it was the voices of wolves. Another said it was the voices of the dead. Miss Ellison snapped at them, telling them not to frighten each other. Yet even she could not silence the feeling that something outside was alive, circling, waiting. Hours dragged like days. The last of the firewood cracked and spit, shrinking into embers. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, sharp and merciless. The teacher tried to distract them with recitations, calling out spelling words over the roar of the storm, but their voices were weak, barely rising above the wind. Every syllable seemed to freeze on their lips, falling useless into the dark. The snow climbed higher outside, blotting out what little light remained. The windows turned white, sealing them in a coffin of ice. Shadows deepened, stretching across the room like black fingers. The air grew heavier, colder, until every breath felt like a shiver drawn straight into the lungs. Then it came, a sound that did not belong to the storm. The schoolhouse door, swollen with frost, gave a long, slow groan. Every head turned as the latch trembled, then lifted, as if touched by an invisible hand. The door creaked open an inch, then another, letting in a violent gust of snow. The children gasped as one, their small bodies stiff with terror. Miss Ellison's candle flickered wildly, and in that frozen breath of silence, the storm outside seemed to pause, as though waiting to see who or what might enter. The door had slammed itself shut again, as though the storm had tired of its cruel trick, but the silence it left behind pressed heavier than the snow outside. The children clung together in uneasy stillness, wide eyes fixed on the trembling latch. Miss Ellison's lips were pale, yet her voice cut through the fear with the sternness of command. "Back to your seats," she ordered, though her own hands shook as she gathered her skirts. Obediently, the children shuffled back to their benches, their boots squeaking against the frozen boards, their breaths floating before them like fragile spirits. The blackboard still bore the unfinished lessons of that morning, a half-written date, numbers scrawled in chalk, words that now seemed absurdly out of place in a room where death pressed so close. Miss Ellison seized the chalk, her knuckles white, and continued the lesson as though nothing had happened. Her voice cracked once, then steadied. "Repeat after me," she said, tracing letters across the board, her script uneven with cold. The children whispered in chorus, their voices thin as thread. But the storm outside refused to be ignored. Snow slammed against the glass with such force that frost patterns spiderwebbed across the panes, growing thicker, darker, until the windows became pale, glowing tombstones. Each breath inside turned to ice crystals that fell like ash, settling on desks, hair, and open books. The air stung their throats, fingers cramped around pencils. Yet still they wrote, still they spoke, clinging to routine as though spelling words could keep the blizzard at bay. Then it began, a faint tapping, at first so soft it could have been the settling of the roof. Tap, tap, tap. The children faltered in their recitation, their voices dying into silence. Miss Ellison froze, chalk squeaking into a broken line on the board. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of the storm. Then again, tap, deliberate, patient, like fingernails or bones against wood. It came from the walls, low to the floor, moving slowly, almost thoughtfully. One girl whimpered, covering her ears. A boy whispered, "It's trying to get in." Miss Ellison's jaw tightened. She snapped at them to continue writing, to ignore it. But her eyes betrayed her, darting toward the wall, toward the sound that slithered closer. She forced the children back to their lessons, but the rhythm of the chalk was broken by that other rhythm beneath it. Scratch, tap, scratch. The tapping stopped. Relief spread like warmth for a fleeting instant. Then the glass shattered. A single pane burst inward with a scream of ice, shards scattering across the floor, snow rushing in like a living hand. The children shrieked, some tumbling from their benches. Miss Ellison flung herself toward the stove, shielding them, her candle knocked sideways, smoke rising from its extinguished wick. The wind roared inside the schoolhouse, lifting papers, overturning books, flinging chalk dust like pale smoke into the air. And in that chaos, amid the flying frost and screams, one boy swore he saw a shadow standing just beyond the broken window, tall, unmoving, staring through the veil of snow. When the gust finally died, the silence returned. The window gaped open to the storm, its jagged edge like teeth. Snowflakes drifted inward, settling on desks like a shroud. The children huddled together, breathless. Miss Ellison raised her head, her eyes fixed on that dark square of broken glass. Something had been there, watching, waiting. By the third day, hunger had become its own presence in the room, a silent beast gnawing at every stomach, hollowing eyes, bending backs. The storm outside did not relent. Its white fists pounded ceaselessly against the frail boards, shaking the shutters, sealing the schoolhouse ever deeper in snow. Inside, the last crumbs of bread had long since been divided, licked from trembling palms as if they were gold. Now the children sat gaunt and pale, lips cracked, their breath weaker, their words slower. Miss Ellison tried to keep their spirits alive. She read aloud from the few books they had, her voice hoarse, her hands shaking as she turned brittle pages. She spoke of history, of scripture, of lessons meant to discipline the mind. Yet the children's eyes followed her not with obedience, but with a feverish, desperate gleam. They were no longer listening to the words. They were listening to the silence between them, the silence where hunger lived. The stove sat dark and lifeless now, its belly cold, its last ember buried in ash. The air had grown so frigid that even sound seemed frozen, hanging heavy before falling into nothingness. The smallest children whimpered, their hands clutched to their ribs as though to keep themselves from caving inward. Older boys stared into the corners, their gazes hollow, their jaws working wordlessly as if chewing phantom food. It was then that one of them, a boy named Samuel, froze in his seat, eyes wide. "There," he whispered, pointing toward the whitened window. The others turned, shivering, following his trembling finger. Beyond the frost-crusted glass, the storm twisted and whirled, shapeless and blinding. Yet Samuel swore he saw a figure, not swaying like a tree in the wind, not shifting like snow, but standing, still, watching. Gasps broke through the silence. Children pressed close, peering with wide eyes. But when the next gust came, the shape dissolved into whiteness, gone as though it had never been. "It's nothing," Miss Ellison said, her voice too quick, too sharp. "The storm plays tricks on the eyes." Yet even as she spoke, her pulse raced, her throat dry. She had seen it too, only for a flicker, but enough to chill her deeper than the cold. Whispers broke out, thin and frantic. Some said it was a farmer come to save them. Others muttered that it was a spirit, one of the dead, drawn to the schoolhouse like a grave calling its own. Samuel began to cry, insisting the storm had called his name. The children hushed him, terrified of what might hear, but he pressed his hands over his ears, rocking, sobbing, swearing that the voice was inside his head. Miss Ellison seized him, shaking him, her own voice trembling with fury and fear. "Stop, stop this madness!" But her command did nothing to calm the room. The whispers spread like cracks in glass, brittle and unstoppable. Then, as though mocking them, a lull fell across the storm. The wind dropped into a deep, eerie stillness. The silence that followed was worse than the roar. In that hush, every child heard it, a sound beneath their hunger, beneath their fear. A voice, low, cold, stretching through the storm, calling another name. Darkness fell early, swallowing the prairie until horizon and sky dissolved into one unbroken void. The schoolhouse, already entombed in drifts of snow, seemed to sink deeper into silence with every passing hour. Inside, the children lay in clusters upon the floor, their bodies pressed together for warmth, their breaths shallow, their eyes half closed. The storm roared, then fell quiet, then roared again, like some monstrous breath rising and falling around them. Miss Ellison sat upright by the dead stove, her hands clasped tight, though she no longer prayed. Her eyes burned with sleeplessness, her ears tuned to every shifting sound of the walls. The children whispered among themselves, voices thin and fragile. At first they spoke of home, of mothers' voices, of suppers left steaming on tables, of warm beds left behind. Their words were broken, trembling, and yet for a moment the visions comforted them. But then, slowly, other whispers crept in. Whispers that did not belong to the children. They began in the corners, low, rasping murmurs, curling around the timbers like smoke. Miss Ellison stiffened, staring into the darkness, her pulse hammering in her throat. The children froze, their eyes wide, straining to hear. And then came words, faint but distinct, spoken in voices that some recognized. One girl whimpered that she heard her mother calling. A boy insisted it was his father's voice, urging him home. Others nodded, their faces pale with hope and dread. The sound wove through the storm outside, threading with the wind, pulling at them with invisible strings. One child, dazed and glassy-eyed, rose unsteadily to his feet. He staggered toward the door, lips parted as though answering an unseen call. Miss Ellison leapt forward, seizing his arm, yanking him back with desperate strength. He struggled, whispering, "She's outside, she's waiting for me." The others stirred, their own bodies trembling with the pull of phantom voices. Some sobbed, some reached for the latch, some stared blankly as though already halfway gone. Miss Ellison shouted, her voice hoarse, commanding them back, but her authority was crumbling. The storm itself had joined the lesson, teaching them to obey something older, darker, and more patient than her. In a last act of defiance, she struck a match and lit her final candle. The flame sputtered, fragile, trembling in the air as though the darkness itself pressed against it. She held it high, her face lit by its faint glow, her voice rising in desperate prayer. For a heartbeat it seemed to work, the whispers fell back, the children stilled, the room reclaimed a fragile silence. But then the flame shivered. It bent sideways as though exhaled upon by something unseen. Miss Ellison's breath caught. Her hands tightened. The children huddled closer, eyes wide. The candle guttered once, twice. The shadows swelled, filling every crack, every corner. And then the flame died. Darkness devoured the room in a single breath. The children screamed. a chorus drowned instantly by the return of the whispers, louder now, layered, dozens of voices rising from walls, floor, ceiling, storm. Voices of mothers, fathers, strangers, the lost, the dead. Voices that filled the air until it seemed the schoolhouse itself was speaking. Miss Ellison reached out blindly in the blackness, searching for the children. But all she touched was the cold floorboards, slick with frost. And from the door came the unmistakable sound of the latch lifting. When a pale dawn finally clawed its way through the blizzard's veil, the storm had not lifted. It merely changed its voice, softening into a muffled growl that smothered the prairie beneath endless white. Inside the schoolhouse, silence held the children like chains. They lay stiffly against one another, their eyes red from crying, their throats raw from screams that had vanished into the dark hours before. Only Miss Ellison moved, her hands fumbling to relight the candle, though every match she struck guttered instantly in the damp air. It was then she noticed it. One child was missing. A gap yawned between the small, curled bodies. His blanket lay discarded, his bench empty. Yet the door was still sealed tight beneath a wall of snow, the window's jagged teeth undisturbed. The others sat up, realization dawning in their hollow eyes. Whispers rose, panicked and shrill. Miss Ellison searched every corner, her breath catching in frantic bursts. "Thomas!" she cried, though her voice broke with fear. But no answer came, only the moan of the storm pressing harder against the boards. At last she saw them, footprints. Small, bare imprints pressed faintly into the frost that coated the floorboards. They began at the missing child's bench, staggered toward the center of the room, and ended there. No return, no path to door or window, simply vanishing mid-stride as though the boy had stepped out of the world itself. The children recoiled, clutching one another, their whispers turning frantic. The storm took him. No, the whispers. He went under the floor. The suggestions multiplied like shadows until every corner of the schoolhouse seemed alive with dread. Miss Ellison forced herself to stillness, her heart pounding. She told them it was a mistake, that the boy had hidden, that he was frightened and would soon appear. Her words rang hollow even to herself, for her eyes had already strayed toward the floor, toward the boards. The storm shifted then, tearing free a drift that had pressed hard against the outer wall. Through a crack between the planks, the earth revealed itself, frozen, black and cruel. And in that exposed soil, pale fragments jutted upward, bones, bleached by frost, clawing toward the surface like fingers of the buried. A scream tore from one of the girls, her voice sharp as glass. Others cried out, covering their eyes. Miss Ellison turned sharply, insisting it was only the remains of animals, but her face betrayed her. In her stomach, she felt the truth writhe. These were not the bones of beasts. The silence that followed was broken not by wind, but by sound beneath them. Scratch, faint, patient, directly under where the children sat huddled. They leapt to their feet, the floor trembling beneath them, dust rising in small clouds. Scratch, then another, louder, as though something clawed its way upward from beneath the frozen earth, searching for the seams between the boards. The children shrieked, clutching Miss Ellison's skirts, pressing against the walls. Her eyes darted wildly, her hands shaking, her own breath caught in her chest. And then came the sound again. Not scratching now, but knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks from directly beneath their feet. The storm grew wilder with each hour, as though the prairie itself had chosen to bury them alive. The walls of the schoolhouse groaned, timber bending under the weight of snow. The windows were long since sealed, pressed flat with white, and now even the roof shuddered with every screaming gust. Inside, the air had grown so cold it hurt to breathe. Every exhalation rose in thick clouds that seemed to freeze and fall back down as dust. The children no longer sat at their desks. They huddled in corners, curled in trembling knots, their faces gray with hunger and fear. Their lips were blue, their small hands stiff as claws. Some muttered incoherently, lost in fevered half-dreams, calling out to mothers or whispering fragments of prayers. The youngest whimpered without sound, their voices too weak to rise above the storm. Miss Ellison drifted among them like a ghost, her body swaying with exhaustion. Her fingers were numb, her skirts stiff with frost. She tried to comfort, to hush, to keep them from falling into panic, but her own resolve was crumbling. She had not slept, she had not eaten. Her blood felt as brittle as the ice that crept along the walls. Every breath cut her lungs, every step left her swaying. It was then that the first child collapsed. A girl no older than 9 slumped sideways with a dull thud, her body limp, her lips parted in silence. The children around her screamed, clutching one another, their terror spilling into the frozen air. Miss Ellison fell to her knees, shaking the girl, calling her name, pressing an ear against her chest. But there was nothing, no breath, no warmth, only stillness, as though the storm had claimed her as its first toll. The others cried out, the sound shrill and breaking, their voices rising higher and higher until it seemed the walls themselves might shatter. Their cries became one long wail, shaking the rafters, filling the room with raw terror. And then the storm answered. A hollow moan rolled across the prairie, deeper than the wind, stranger than any sound of nature. It seeped through the boards, winding around them like smoke. It was not a howl of wolves, nor the groan of trees, but something human, dozens of voices rising in unison, a choir of the lost carried on the blizzard's breath. The children fell silent at once, their screams cut short as though strangled. Wide eyes turned toward the walls, ears straining. The sound came again, low, mournful, endless, echoing like the song of a grave. Miss Ellison clutched the dead girl to her chest, her heart hammering, her lips trembling with denial. But then she heard it clearly, carried within that wailing chorus. Her name, whispered as though from lips pressed against her very ear, stretched thin with ice pulled from the storm itself. Sarah. The children heard it too. Their eyes turned to her, wide and pleading, as if she alone had invited the storm inside. And then from the darkness beyond the window, something rapped against the glass. Not the wind, not the snow. A knuckle, once, twice, slowly, as though asking to be let in. When at last the storm broke, it did so not with gentleness, but with a silence more suffocating than the blizzard itself. The prairie lay buried, transformed into an endless white desert where fence posts and farmhouses vanished beneath the drifts. The air was clear, sharp as broken glass, the sky wide and pitiless. It was into this terrible stillness that the rescuers rode, their horses plunging through the snow, their faces stiff with frost. They followed no trail, only rumor, only dread, until they saw the roof of the schoolhouse jutting from the frozen expanse like the last stone of a ruined church. The men dug with bare hands and shovels, chipping away the ice, until at last the door gave way with a scream of splintering wood. They stepped inside, lanterns held aloft, their breath hissing in the darkness. What they found silenced even the strongest among them. The children were there, all of them. Their small bodies lay in clusters, huddled together as if clinging still to warmth. Some had their hands locked tight around one another, their faces pressed close. Their skin was pale, their eyes closed, their mouths frozen mid-cry. Yet what unsettled the rescuers most was their arrangement. They had not fallen randomly, nor scattered in panic. They were gathered in a circle, as if summoned into ritual, their frozen fingers pointing toward the center of the room. There sat Miss Ellison, upright, eyes wide open. Her lips drawn back as though caught mid-scream, her body stiff as iron. She stared directly ahead, her gaze fixed on nothing. Her hands were bloody, though no wound could be found. And carved into the floor before her, etched into the wood with trembling, desperate strokes, were symbols, crude, overlapping marks gouged by dozens of small hands. Circles, lines, jagged stars. Names, too, half-written, scratched until the letters tore into the boards. The rescuers gathered the bodies in silence, carrying them out one by one into the merciless light of day.